Now, one of our earlier stories took us to the Middle East, where Qatar now has become the, I suppose, the victim of diplomatic severance by Gulf state allies there. To talk to us a little bit about that development is Naeem Jinnah from the Afro-Middle East Center. He joins us now on the line. Naeem, thank you very much for joining us. Always a pleasure to talk to you. So, I mean, some people would look at this and say this is pretty dramatic. More than 5 states have cut ties with Qatar. What's gone wrong?
Well, it is pretty dramatic, but it's not the first time that this kind of thing has happened, of course. In 2014, the same countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, cut diplomatic ties. This time, it's much more serious, of course. They've cut communication ties, they've cut travel ties, etc., not allowing flyover rights to Qatari planes and all of that. So it's much more serious. What has happened is that there's 2 things. I mean, for the Saudis, they are unhappy that Qatar has not taken as hard a line as they would like against Iran. The UAE is unhappy that Qatar has taken a soft line and in fact gives refuge to some members of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, etc., who the Emiratis, the UAE regards as its enemies. And so when Donald Trump gave his speech in Riyadh, pointing to firstly Iran and secondly terrorist organizations in which he included Hamas, that in a sense gave the opening for these 2 to move ahead against Qatar. And so we're seeing the actions that we saw over the past few days.
Why is it that Qatar is seemingly out of step with its immediate regional neighbors?
Well, you know, there's the sense that many of us have that the Gulf Cooperation Council countries are all in step with each other. They're not. If you consider that Qatar is on one side on this, on the other is the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and of course it's proxies. You know, Saudi Arabia's proxies being Bahrain, one faction in Yemen, and the UAE's proxies being Egypt, Khalifa Haftar in Libya, etc. But it's Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Kuwait and Oman have remained silent. In fact, Kuwait has said that it wants to mediate. Kuwait also has relations with Iran. So the GCC is not united on these issues, number one. Number 2, as far as Qatar is concerned, it has over the past, say, 2 decades, taken an independent line, certainly in terms of its foreign policy, to other GCC countries, and particularly Saudi Arabia. I mean, if you look at the map, Qatar is really a tiny speck compared to Saudi Arabia. And it has attempted to take an alternative foreign policy line to Saudi Arabia, sometimes converging, but not always. And this is why we saw the diplomatic break-off in 2014 as well. And Qatar believes that the only way for it to be on its own, to come into its own, is to have that kind of independence and not to constantly look at its bigger neighbor, Saudi Arabia, for guidance or to be pushed by it.
All right, so, you know, a lot of the talk that's coming through is that Qatar sponsors and supports terrorist organizations and militant Islamists in the region. But is their biggest sin perhaps Iran at the moment?
Well, as I say, for Saudi Arabia, certainly the biggest thing is Iran. Rather than, you know, with the previous king, groups such as Hamas, etc., were not acceptable. But with the current king, he's willing to tolerate that. So for Saudi Arabia, Iran is the big issue because Iran and Saudi Arabia are locked in a battle for hegemony in the region. For the UAE, it's these groups. It's the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course is not a militant group. Hamas is, has an armed wing, and the shelter that is provided to these groups by Qatar.
So you mentioned Donald Trump a short while ago, and it is interesting that Donald Trump's been in the region, signed the biggest military deal in history, and all of this happens. But Qatar has an interesting relationship with the US, military on military, and there's even a US base in the area. So what will this mean for the US-Qatar relationship?
Yeah, and the U.S. Its biggest base in the Middle East and North Africa region is actually in Qatar. What it would mean, this is an interesting thing because part of the agenda, particularly of the United Arab Emirates, is to try and pressurize the American government in order to downgrade its relationship with Qatar. And so in the run-up to the announcement over the past few days, what we saw was a campaign in the United States, in Washington in particular, behind which has been the UAE ambassador to Washington, a campaign to demonize Qatar in the media and through think tanks, etc., and to push the line that the United States should downgrade its relationship with Qatar, should move its base out of Qatar to Saudi Arabia, that Qatar is a sponsor of terrorism, etc. In a sense, in the eyes of people like Donald Trump, trying to put Qatar in the same category as Iran. So that campaign has been ongoing. Now with these cutting off links with Qatar and putting pressure on Qatar, the UAE, and to a lesser extent I think Saudi Arabia, but certainly the UAE is hoping that the Americans will now follow suit and will go along with what they've been asking for.
All right, we've run out of time, but very briefly, if you can answer this. This seems like the most severe action taken by these Gulf states on Qatar at this time. And the question now must be, is it likely that Qatar will be expelled from OPEC?
No. I don't think that there's any likelihood of that. I don't think it'll be expelled from OPEC. It won't be expelled from the GCC either. Immediately, we're going to see attempts at mediation. Whether they succeed or not in the next couple of weeks, we'll see. But I don't think any of those are on the table, and I don't think military action is on the table yet.
All right, Naeem Jinnah, thank you very much indeed, as always, for your insights.